Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, people are increasingly moving across borders to live and work, but far-right groups in the West are blaming their economic grievances on migrants. But what impact do they actually have on economies? Known as banker to the poor, Bangladesh's interim leader Mohammad Yunus is tasked with fixing a troubled economy. Can the Nobel laureate steady the ship? And Olympic gold medals are now worth more than ever before, but has the Paris Olympiad been a source of much-needed revenue for France or a drag on its economy? From Donald Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric to the wave of violence that swept across England and Northern Ireland, the debate around the impact of immigration on local economies is heating up. Far-right politicians in the West blame economic grievances on the unprecedented influx of migrants, and they're mobilising their supporters to push anti-immigration policies and gain power. But are immigrants to blame for the lack of jobs, stagnant wages, inequality and declining public services? Or is it more about failing government policies? We'll discuss that with our guest shortly. But first, Katia Lopez-Hodayan reports.
Far-right protests in the UK have made international headlines recently, reigniting the debate over immigration. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer described the protest as far-right thuggery.
Whatever the apparent motivation, this is not protest. It is pure violence, and we will not tolerate attacks on mosques or our Muslim communities.
In Britain, as well as throughout Europe, stagnant wages, financial inequality, and general economic hardship have been linked to the rise of anti-immigrant attitudes. It's rhetoric that analysts say has been exploited by the far right in recent days, with protesters wrongly blaming migrants for their problems.
It's not to do with race or religion, these riots. I think it's just got to a point where the British public are sick to death of the government prioritising all the new immigrants that are coming in the country over their own British citizens.
Across Europe and the United States, politicians have for years exploited the topic of immigration to energize their base.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
That was back in 2015. Now, almost a decade later, former U.S. President Donald Trump is again campaigning on immigration, promising mass deportations.
We will seal the border and we will stop Kamala Harris' invasion without delay. It'll happen immediately.
But research shows many countries need migrants to sustain their economies. In the U.S., they're credited with helping the quick economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. Political messaging, however, often focuses elsewhere.
Both parties are basically trying to convince people that you can trust them. You can trust them with your future. You can trust them with your family's future. You can trust it with the future of the country. But you definitely cannot trust the other candidate.
It is true that migration is soaring, and some U.S. cities and local governments are struggling to cope. Immigration courts are overwhelmed, and border agents outnumbered.
And you know, President Trump is standing up for the normal man and woman. He's standing for America first, trying to get back, our American values.
Analysts say immigration has turned into a convenient and misguided target, with frustrations amplified in communities struggling with low wages and a high cost of living.
Attacks are happening, blatant racism is happening. Yeah, it's just sad to see, really.
While managing immigration is a legitimate issue, analysts say the clear economic benefits are often ignored. Yet is being used repeatedly as a tool, many say, across the political spectrum to stir frustrations, to influence votes, and to distract from the government's economic mismanagement. Katia Lopez-Hodayan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, the UN estimates that there were more than 281 million migrants worldwide in 2022, 169 million of whom are workers. Wealthy countries are particularly seeing a record surge in numbers. 3.3 million people moved to the US last year. Canada took in 1.9 million immigrants, while Britain welcomed 1.2 million people. The OECD says that high flows of immigrants into wealthy countries have helped strengthen job markets and boost growth. America's immigration surge could grow its economy by 2% over the next decade. That's more than $7 trillion. Economists say that Germany needs more than 1.5 million foreign workers each year to maintain its labour force. That's because too many people are retiring and too few are entering the job market. While Japan needs more than 1 million foreign workers by 2040 if the government there wants to keep its economic growth target. Migrants globally sent more than $831 billion back to their families in 2022. India, Mexico, China and the Philippines are the main beneficiaries from those remittances. Joining us now from London, Ben Brindle, a researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Ben, good to have you with us. Isn't the fact of the matter that, as we were hearing there, developed nations need immigrants due to the fact that their own workforces are dwindling?
It very much depends. So when it comes to skills gaps, there is evidence to suggest that migrants can fill those skills which are needed. But at the same point, it's important to remember that there aren't a fixed number of jobs in the economy. So say, for example, migration rules change to make it easier for engineers to go to a particular country. Employers could respond to that by demanding more engineers. So the supply has increased, but so too is the demand, and that shortfall will still be there. Also, when it comes to aging populations, it's not simply just about having more people in a particular country, but really at the heart of it, the problem with aging populations is a financial problem. And so when it comes to migration, if it's to be part of the answer to an aging population, it's about having migrants who make a net positive contribution.
So what impact do immigrants have on economies worldwide? We were hearing just a few moments ago that it's overall positive, isn't it? It's a positive impact that they have on these economies.
It very much depends on where we're talking about in the world. A lot of my focus is sort of on the UK, and when we think about Western countries, generally the impacts are quite small. There's no sort of single correct estimate. And actually what I think is really important here is actually the question of who are the migrants that are going to a particular country. So on the one hand, migrants who are in employment and particularly those who are in higher paying jobs tend to have a more positive impact on the economy that they're in. By contrast, migrants who are not in employment and also those who have children, because children tend not to work, but do incur education spending, those groups will have a less positive impact. So the composition is really key to answering that question.
But are people right to blame their economic grievances on the influx of migrants, or is it more to do with failing government policy?
This will very much depend on what we're talking about as to what research evidence will actually show. As I've said, the wage and employment research that's been done suggests there's only a small impact. On the other hand, with things like housing, there are indications that migrants will put additional pressure on rental prices. At least that's something we suspect in the UK. But of course, at the same point, it's important to remember that immigration policy and migration doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's also about what's happening in different policy areas as well. So with housing, increased migration put increased pressure on rental prices, but that's in a context where the housing stock isn't really growing. And so it very much depends, not just on migration, but also what's happening elsewhere too.
And Ben, before we end, a couple of questions about the US. What are we to make of how much the US needs immigrants? I suppose it's all about the right kind of immigrant, isn't it? And how qualified they are to contribute to the American economy.
Yeah, so I should say I'm not an expert in US policy, but again, I think it very much does come down to the composition, as I say, sort of work migrants and study migrants, those that tend to create more benefits. Policies that restrict or reduce flows of those types of people will have a more negative impact. than policies which restrict or reduce flows of, say, family migrants or refugees. Yeah, once again, it's about the composition and the who rather than just migration overall.
And of course, we have to make a distinction between those who are economic immigrants and those who are refugees. Countries like Britain have a legal obligation to take in people who are fleeing for their lives.
Yes, the 1951 convention. Countries have an obligation, as you say, to grant or to at least look at the claims of people who come to particular borders. The same point. Yeah, there's been lots of controversy in the UK. While countries have to look at these claims, sort of other areas, I guess there's a bit more leeway in terms of policies to sort of speak sort of quite generally. Obviously, things differ between different countries.
Ben, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, a Nobel laureate, widely respected economist and microfinance pioneer, Mohammad Yunus has been credited with lifting millions of people in Bangladesh out of poverty. He'll now have to prove that he's the right man to bring economic and political stability to the nation. Yunus was the choice of student protesters who ousted the former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Among the challenges facing him as the head of the interim government are joblessness and the high cost of living. Many experts say that his experience and international reputation could help him with the job ahead. Al Jazeera's Veronica Pedrosa reports.
It's a new stage for Bangladesh, with a new outlook and a new interim government. Now much of the focus is on how the chief advisor, Mohammad Yunus, will manage the challenges.
We have to protect this freedom, not just protect it. We have to ensure that it reaches every single household. Otherwise, the freedom will have no meaning.
The student protests that forced Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to quit and flee the country were partly fueled by tough economic conditions in what was once the world's fastest growing economy. Demonstrations grew, and so did grievances.
We want Bangladesh to be a country where there is peace and reform. State institutions are very important.
At one point, Bangladesh was hailed as an economic miracle, celebrated for lifting millions of people out of poverty, mostly through work in the garment industry. But over time, Hasina's economic model would be criticized, targeted for promoting low wages that made it increasingly difficult for workers to make ends meet. The monthly salary for a garment worker in 2023 averaged about $115. That's after the government increased the minimum wage by 56%. The recent unrest has caused more economic turmoil.
During the protests, our factory closed and lost a lot of money. We were out of work sitting at home. We were scared. We're poor and depend on our daily wages and overtime. If we sit back home, how can we provide for our families?
The head of the caretaker government is a Nobel laureate, economist and banker. Yunus was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for his efforts to bring millions of people out of poverty through microloans. Now, many are wondering if he can undo years of autocratic rule and address the country's inequalities. Protesters say the previous system benefited supporters of Hasina's Awami League, who are among the elite.
We want a conflict-free Bangladesh, where no Awami League, no Bangladesh Nationalist Party and no other political parties can abuse power. I want to forget the past and move on.
Bangladesh is facing uncharted political territory. It may be in its so-called second independence, but it's still facing political instability and tough economic conditions. Veronica Pedrosa, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, here's a look at the state of Bangladesh's $450 billion economy. The South Asian nation's GDP grew by almost 6% last year. The textile industry is one of the biggest drivers of that growth, earning the country more than $46 billion a year. But there aren't enough well-paid jobs for its young people. Unemployment among people between 15 and 24 was at almost 16% in 2023, while inflation was running at nearly 10%. Rising food and commodity prices, in particular, are a major concern for many people in Bangladesh, which has high poverty and income inequality rates. Joining us now from Dhaka in Bangladesh, Salim Rehan, who is a professor of economics at the University of Dhaka. Good to have you with us, Professor. 6% growth is not a bad figure at all. OK, you've got 10% inflation, but that's indicative, I suppose, of a growing economy. If you, Professor, were advising Mohammad Yunus, where would you be telling him to start?
We are in a difficult situation in Bangladesh, and you are right that there was success stories of economic performance. But then what really happened? Because we had a period of almost a decade of high economic growth, reduction in poverty, but then everything went wrong. I think it started since 2020 with the COVID. There was a shock, and then there were several other shocks, Russia-Ukraine war, and then several other things. But I think if I really want to advise the interim government, I would really, ask them to look at some of the very immediate issues. At this moment, we are facing a law and order situation, a serious crisis there. It needs to be restored. Unless a law and order situation is restored, the normal economic activities would not resume. So this is a big challenge now. And also, I think the economic success, what we had in the past, it was really covering up some of the very structural weaknesses in the economy. Especially, that we are facing low revenue generation. Bangladesh is one of the countries with having lowest tax GDP ratio in the world. We are having a serious problems in the banking sector, especially a fragile financial sector. There are problems of corruption, institutional weakness in public expenditure. And there were big infrastructure projects, those were termed as mega projects. And there are huge allegations of rent-seeking activities centering around those mega projects. So the economic success, the model, actually was not really sustainable. And you talked about the ready-made garments and the export success. But at the same time, the export basket was not diversified. It's hugely concentrated around ready-made garments. So this country now need to, especially the interim government, need to identify some of the immediate targets. Definitely this is targeting or countering inflation. But at the same time, they need to lay the foundation for bigger structural reforms in the taxation sector, in the banking sector, way towards how we can diversify our export basket, reduce corruption, and promote more institutional efficiency in public expenditure.
Okay.
It's a huge task list, but I think this is something the country needs at this point.
The protests which brought down the Sheikh Hasina government were driven largely by students. How does Mohammad Yusuf tackle youth unemployment? How does he get young people, Mohammad Yunus, how does he get young people back to work?
In order to get this educated youth back to the job, and especially it's not only the job, but the decent job, the private sector investment need to be picked up. And not only the domestic investment, but also the foreign investment. And the country has not been successful in attracting large-scale foreign direct investment. So the primary task would be how to get the investors' confidence back, how to reduce the cost of doing business, facilitate investment, and remove other barriers, both policy level, regulatory barriers, and structural weaknesses, so that the private investment is promoted and the educated youth and other youth on the economy, they actually get the right kind of job they're looking for.
If Mohammad Yunus tackles all of the issues that you talk about, and it's a big job to do all of that, what are the prospects for Bangladesh's economy?
I see the country has immense potentials. You see, the country, despite many limitations, Bangladesh is the kind of second largest exporter of ready-made garments. And that shows that the country has huge potential. The country is one of the success stories includes Dr. Yunus, this microcredit model. And also the country has a huge youth population, and the country is enjoying that's what we call the demographic dividend, the phase of demographic dividend. So I think what the country really needs, the right kind of politics of development, right kind of economic policies in place, and more importantly, how these policies are implemented. Because there is a serious gap in terms when it comes to having the policies and making them implemented in Bangladesh.
Really good to talk to you, Professor. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk next about the economic impact of the Olympics, but first a brief roundup of what else is making news this week. US credit rating agency Fitch has downgraded Israel a notch, citing the war on Gaza. The agency lowered Israel's rating from A+ to A and kept a negative outlook on the country's credit. Its decision highlights the financial toll of the conflict and indicates another downgrade may happen in the future. But Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, says that the country's economy remains strong. Ghana, Africa's leading gold producer, has opened its first commercial gold refinery. It's being hailed as the start of a new era that will allow Ghana to increase its national earnings. The factory opened in the capital Accra earlier this month. It combines public and private partnerships between an Indian company and Ghana's central bank, which holds a 20% stake in the business. The month of August has a reputation for being one of the most dangerous months in the financial calendar. Now, it's not based on anything scientific, but it's enough to keep people on edge. Like most people, top financial players usually take their summer breaks in August, leaving their deputies in charge. Now, historically, crises have often begun in late summer, which is why the recent market crash earlier this month set alarm bells ringing. In the UK, the pound has suffered 4 devaluations in the past 100 years, and 3 of them have taken place in September. In every case, the writing was on the wall in August. In the US, there's a subprime mortgage and banking crisis that kicked off in August 2007. Given the uncertainty, banks stopped lending to each other, and credit flows dried up well beyond the US, leading to what's become known as the financial crisis. Now, in theory, not much should happen in August. Stock market trading volumes tend to be light, and if the month starts calm, it tends to stay that way. But bad things have repeatedly happened in August, and when they do, they can have profound consequences. Now, they're thrilling to watch, and hosting the Olympics is usually an extraordinary feat. But despite all the excitement surrounding the Games, they come at a high cost, so much so that the International Olympic Committee is finding it harder to lock in locations for future Olympiads. This year's Olympics and Paralympics are estimated to have cost France nearly $10 billion. That's less expensive than previous competitions in London, Rio, and Tokyo. But despite that, many people are wondering whether hosting them is worth the billion-dollar price tag. Well, the Bank of France says the nation's economy may have received a boost from the Paris Olympics in the third quarter of the year. The economic benefits were largely driven by ticket sales and TV rights, while tourism-related sales saw a 25% increase year on year. Meanwhile, gold medals at this year's Games are worth nearly $900 each. The medals contain 6 grams of gold, the price of which increased to a record in mid-July. Joining us now from London is Philip Barker, a sports analyst and Olympic historian. Good to have you with us, Philip. What do you make of the Paris Olympics, then? The Bank of France says that the economy has received something of a boost. Do you agree with that?
Well, the figures seem to suggest that they certainly put up the prices of the hotels, and more people were going. Paris was seething with people visiting the shops, the arcades, the restaurants, and so forth. And even the prices on the underground and the taxi fares were bumped up. So there was a little bit of an increase certainly there. But, the cost of the Olympics has always been a problem ever since they revived them for the modern era in 1896. The Greeks actually had real financial problems then, and they had to get a benevolent local businessman to underwrite the entire cost of renovating their stadium. So it's not a new phenomenon, but certainly there are benefits for Paris. One of which is the actual perception of the city. A lot of people came away with a completely changed perception of how Parisians were, because they'd been welcoming, the police were welcoming, everybody around gave a good image. And that's a sort of intangible legacy that over the years, Paris may well find has an ongoing benefit as more people want to visit the city.
The Paris Games cost less than the Olympiads in London and in Rio. How did France pull that off, do you think?
Well, by not building nearly as much, they did build a new aquatic centre and spent a lot of the cost went on the Olympic Village, which they say is going to be used for housing or for parks and so on and so forth. They actually converted an old factory into the main dining room at the village. The security of everywhere was heightened, so that adds to the cost. You had, what, 45 million, I think, 45,000 security staff there. Let's not bump up the figure, but police seem to be everywhere in the city. It did feel safe, but of course, all this comes at a cost, and someone ultimately has to pay that cost.
As you say, Paris got a PR boost that will continue to bring in tourists and revenue further down the line. But can you understand the reticence, perhaps, of other countries wanting and other cities wanting to host the Games, given the cost, and that they might not be as desirable to visit as places such as London, Paris, Sydney, Tokyo?
You can certainly understand the reticence, and this is why the International Olympic Committee, who are the supreme authority of the Games, they introduced about 10 years ago a roadmap called Agenda 2020, which they claim revolutionized candidate procedure for the Olympics. And in their words, the Games were to be fully aligned with the priority of future hosts, with a new flexible approach. And they claim this bears fruit and is well appreciated, and shaping bidding process in a way that benefits the host city. Now, whether that leads to a more transparent bidding process remains to be seen. It seems to be that the IOC are targeting the cities they want and the cities that feel that they can get something from staging the Games, but it's very much narrowing the pool. And there is a danger that you're only going to have a select group of cities able to stage the Games in future, because the costs, no matter what they say about we'll use existing facilities, the level of facilities that are expected is still eye-wateringly high in terms of the costs. Even the opening ceremony, you're talking in millions and millions to actually stage the opening ceremony now, which so there are lots of zeros being added to the cost at any given Games, no matter what they do. So fewer and fewer countries, I think, are going to be able to say, yes, we can become an Olympic host.
Good to talk to you, Philip. Thanks for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at A Finnegan on X. Please use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire programs for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.